be me. Around 10 to 11 years old. Living in a middle-class broken family. The kind I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Alcoholic mother, hard-working father away from family often due to work, a few siblings. For sure not the ideal family, but nothing worth getting pity for. The story starts on a particularly bad day for me, where I was bullied pretty hard in school. I also was super introverted and had pretty much no friends there, which didn't help. Like usual, I came home to my drunk mother. The house smelled like cheap wine and smoke. I can't remember why, but she was pretty angry at me and ended up whacking me in the face with a wine bottle. This set my older brother off and he and my mom got into a shouting match where some pretty harsh things were said about us. I took the situation really poorly and being a stupid little kid, I decided to run away. Now for a little more background. Behind my house was a large expanse of forest. Not too far out was an abandoned campground where lots of the local kids would hang out in. It was an old RV park with a couple dozen structures that were left behind. Some of the areas were a bit sketchy and only a handful of kids explored the whole place. My older brother being one of them, drew up a map of the place. It wasn't great, but it was readable. Taking the map, I left in the middle of the night. There was a lodge I passed once before and thought that would be a good place to hold out. Looking back, I'm surprised how stupid I was to do something this dumb. I was super familiar with most of the area and only really need the map for the last half or so mile, which that probably helped quell any fear I felt. I ended up walking 3 or so miles. I have a very vivid memory of arriving there. It was a cloudless summer night, so the moon and fireflies made it surprisingly colorful. The lodge hadn't been used in probably 15 years. It was isolated enough for it to be only damaged by the overgrown plants, then at their height in summer. I went in and started up a fire and cooked up some beans from a can. Despite the fire, I was cold inside and I could even see my breath. The night sounds were louder than I was used to and I was put on edge. Remembering a ladder to the roof my older brother made the first time I passed the lodge, I decided I could sleep better up there where it may be warmer. I found an area where the high parts of the wall shielded me from any wind and set up a little bed. Up until that point I was distracting myself pretty well with the adventure and nature, but everything from the day just hit me really hard as I was trying to go to sleep. Looking back, I feel like I was a bit of a crybaby. As I was sobbing, I felt on edge again. I was really cold. I never came closer to pissing myself when I heard the sound of creaking on the stairs. I didn't pull it onto the roof with me cause what, a deer was gonna climb up and mug me? I was pretty sure I was screwed. I was warned about pedophiles and other degenerates who might be lurking back here. I wish I could say I bravely pulled out my knife to stave off the threat, or at least that I ran over to the ladder and pulled it up, but I just continued to sob, now covering myself with a blanket. Either from the cold or fear, I was shaking so much that I'd be seen right away by anything that came up on the roof. The stepping became clear as they started moving on the roof and I pretty much accepted my fate. I felt 2 arms wrap around me, understandably giving me a heart attack. To my confusion though, they were surprisingly soft and gentle. Whatever was out there was hugging me from behind through the blanket. It felt like it was in my head, but I swear I could hear cooing. I never felt so content before in my life. For a minute or so I just sat there conflicted between the secureness from the hug and my adrenaline spiking. The moment I felt the arms come off me I snapped back to reality and threw the blanket off me. I looked around and saw no one. I was in fight or flight mode and didn't even question where whatever it was went. I launched down the ladder headfirst and sprinted home the fastest I ever did. The moment I passed the tree line I threw up and collapsed from sprinting 3 miles. While lying on the ground my brain started to realize that the whole situation didn't make sense. My fear was replaced with curiosity as I continued to think about it. I caught my breath and eventually went home. It was pretty late, so I climbed through one of my windows that had a broken look and screamed to avoid making noise. For the 3 hours I had till I had to wake up I slept like a rock. The only reason I could wake up is because I was dragged out of bed by my brother. It was a Friday, so I felt a bit better about going to school. This might not be relevant, but most of the kids seemed to treat me coldly. This lasted until I left my school district for high school. That might have been because of my exhaustion or something, but I remember they wanted nothing to do with me. The only kids who would even interact with me were the ones who were messing with me. Halfway through the day, the teacher's pet threw some of his lunch at the back of my head. Like clockwork, for some reason the teacher yelled at me for making a mess. The day was going so shit, and all I could think about was how good it felt last night when I was being held. Between the harassment and cold shoulders, I couldn't wait to go home. Without even hesitating, I started to prepare to go back to the campground the moment I got home. Right as I was opening the door, my little sister came running up to me. She was crying with a black eye. I figured my jerk of a mother hit her. I ended up comforting her for a while until she felt better before leaving. It worked out because it started to get dark as I left. Like the night before, I trekked to the lodge and set up camp on the roof. I began to feel the air get cold, followed by a smell. It wasn't unpleasant, but the smell wasn't all that great either. I wanted to see what was going on, but I was nervous and hid once I started hearing the footsteps again. This time I expected it and leaned a bit into the hug. For an hour or so I just rested in the embrace, listening to the cooing here and there. I felt like the arms would rub up and down sometimes. It was nice. Eventually it let up and I threw the blanket off me. I didn't see anyone, but I was greeted by one hell of a sight. It was like I could see every star in the sky through the clearing in the trees the lodge made. The moon was full and bright, and firefly lit up the trees. Even though I didn't see anyone, I didn't feel alone. I know it's dumb, but the idea of a ghost didn't pop into my head until recalling the story. I gazed at the stars until I felt it was time to return. Before I left, I brought a flower to the roof and left it there. It was nice being able to walk back home. I slept like a log and woke up brighter than ever before. These things started to become a routine. The other kids avoided me more than usual. Come home to comfort my younger siblings. Go to the campground to chill with the ghost. Leave a flower before I leave. It wasn't every day, but these were all frequent. It was the first time in a while I was content. Unfortunately, things didn't last. I wanted to leave earlier, so I began to ignore my siblings. Even with the extra time, I'd spend less time out there with that feeling of being with someone. I was upset I was losing this connection. I was getting so frustrated that I eventually yelled at my sister to leave me alone one afternoon before leaving. I can remember my older brother's disapproving face in that moment. That night I felt nothing out in the woods. I brought another flower to the roof like I'd normally do to beckon it. Before I could even go up the ladder, I was hit with an intense cold. A feeling of dread and shame came over me as I looked up the ladder and saw a vague silhouette of a person. There were no features, just an outline. I desperately thought about what I was doing wrong. Maybe it was the shame I was feeling deep down, but I realized somehow it was the way I was treating my siblings. It had comforted me like I was supposed to comfort my siblings. While not in a full-blown panic, I returned home with sense of agency. The next morning, I remember apologizing my little sister and giving her a big hug. From that point till we left the house, I made sure to always treat her well. To a lesser extent, my little brother, 'cause he was a hardy little asshole, but same deal. I didn't see it again and repressed the memory. My siblings all became close over the years and my mother eventually passed. The event was bittersweet, remembering the good and the bad we experienced with her. At the funeral, my sister thanked me for being there for her when she needed me. That night while running outside, I felt a chill over my shoulder, and I could swear I saw that silhouette in the woods. That was last night. I always felt like it was a she, was there for me at a really bad time, and I ended up forgetting about her. While I can't say my life is perfect, she helped me to value family more. I would like for her to be at peace and pass, or whatever it is ghosts do. If there were any flowers blooming this time of year, I'd leave a flower on the side of the road. As autistic as it may sound, I'm probably gonna buy some flowers and take them with me on my run. Maybe I'm just a schizo. What do you think I should do? Sorry for the delay. Grad school is a bitch. I'll try to post throughout the day, but it will probably be sporadic at best. I also didn't save my original word vomit, so I'm going to have to reread my journal to remember all the details. Anyways, I'll just jump right into it. Be me. First year of my undergrad has just ended. Despite all the support I've had, I was admittedly driverless and depressed. My family started to take note of this and came up with a plan to try and put me on the right path. As you can probably guess from the last story, my father finally divorced her and gained full custody over all my siblings. We were old enough to survive on our own, but as a way to try and make up for our mother's behavior, he tried to be more active in our lives. Upon hearing my older brother tell him about my general outlook on life, he decided the summer would be a great time to spice up my resume he had been bugging me to do things for. My father had become, well, not a rich millionaire, pretty well off financially from all his hard work and traveling, and remarried an Ecuadorian woman. Considering where we started out, it really shows what hard work can do. Being a bio major interested in genetics, using my father's surplus of free air miles and my stepmother's connections, they decided to send me to the Galapagos Islands. I feel like I was such a jerk-off looking back because I just didn't want to go. I wanted to stay home and just vegetate. I wasn't spoiled enough to even think about turning down such though, and left with complaint. I think it was early June when I landed on the island of San Cristobal. Despite my hesitation, it wasn't like I wasn't excited about being there at all. I had 2 months ahead of me of long work days though, and the hard work was daunting, made being there cheap as fuck though. Coming off the plane, I immediately was disappointed by the hostel I was living in, pig-related. Third world living conditions, cockroaches and spiders the size of my hand covering everywhere including my bed, and wild animals making every second of the day and night as loud as they could. I lived and worked with dozens of other volunteers from around the world and would build bonds lasting to this day with many of them. It's so funny how I was upset coming in the first day, because starting the next day it would be the greatest and most exciting 2 months of my life. I even held hands with girl for the first time. Sorry, ghost girl. I could go on a million-line green text about the whole amazing experience volunteering there, but this is /X and I wouldn't be telling this story if something odd didn't happen. This story takes place in my last week on the archipelago. I worked my ass off so much that I, along with the 3 other people in this story, got the last week to fuck off. While I came to love San Cristobal, I wanted to spend this time traveling to the other islands. For $20 or so you could take a speedboat to different islands. After mapping out our final plan the night before, we left early the next morning. Got a huge goodbye from the cutie pie French girl I held hands with. Now for some background on the people with me. First there was Max. A tall German with perfect English. He was there before I, and was almost like a mentor when getting used to the islands despite his younger age. Next was Anne, another German but a short girl. She spoke again perfect English and Spanish. Max and I didn't pick up all that much Spanish at the time. And finally was this half Ecuadorian from Switzerland named Andre. I knew him for over a month, and while his Spanish was perfect, his English was pretty bad, only slightly better than my Spanish. Our end goal was to arrive at the Isla Isabela and try and swim with some penguins and do some camping. Before then though we need to pass through the central island, Santa Cruz. It was by far the worst and most touristy island. I say this talking about a string of beautiful tropical islands, so I'm not saying it was bad. Just due to the timing of the speedboats, we had to spend at least one night there. Luckily there was lots to do while we waited there, and we made our way over to one of the beaches we heard about. Once we got to Tortuga Bay, we wasted no time jumping into the water and swimming with the animals. As usual it was a pretty good time, but this was the first of a series of bad decisions we made that would lead to probably the most terrifying experience in my life. I can remember that jerk-off Andre saying in his broken English, our stuff open while he pointed at our bags we left on the beach. We told Andre to keep an eye on the bags, which he didn't, and as a result we were robbed. Thankfully it seemed like only the money we brought with us was stolen, which wasn't too bad since we had to pre-buy all our tickets. Still, this meant we had to cut back on our spending. No more hotels. As angry as I was at Andre, none of us were watching them, so I couldn't be too mad. We spent the night sleeping on the docks watching the pelicans get chased around by the schools of little sharks. Daybreak came and we hopped on our boat to Isabella. The normal trip time was 3 or so hours, but it took us almost 5 because of the gale that intercepted us. The sight of the island piercing through the storm was awing. The waves were so large and powerful that the sound and sight of them crashing into the black could be noticed a kilometer away from the island in the middle of the storm. The peaks of the island were covered by the clouds, with only the volcanic peak of the Midas glowing through the clouds. As haunting as the island seemed, I'll spoil it and tell you this isn't another ghost story. As quickly as the storm came, it passed, and by the time we set foot on the island, the sun was shining. We spent our first day there familiarizing ourselves with the island and trying to spot penguins. I love those little guys, and while I didn't swim with them I did see enough to satisfy me. With that off our bucket list we went off to try and camp out in the island. We also took note of how skittish the locals were. The little town we came to looked like one of those pictures of an area that was hit by a tsunami. Another thing we had to watch out for was the wild dogs. On the other islands they were at worst big and overly friendly, but here they were all big aggressive pit bulls and other big dogs that probably grew large on the local wildlife. Either way, we were determined to go camping and we started on our journey. We decided to take one of the set-up trails and move into the wilderness of the island at its end. If you know anything about these islands, you'd know that this is a bit of a no-no. After a month or so of helping the island from the damage mainly caused by those ungrateful locals, we were regretfully quick to disregard the rules on that. The customs between islands didn't even care enough to stop us from bringing machetes and camping equipment, so why would we care? The 5 kilometers path lead to an old wall known by the locals as the Wailing Wall. The islands were once penal colonies, and this wall was one of the last standing parts of an old sugar factory or something. Their independence was bloody, or so they claim. Behind the wall was the vast expanse of the island running hundreds of kilometers to the north. At the end of the path we were met with a sign, warning about hunters. The locals like to hunt the invasive species they brought to the islands like the goats. While this seems like a good thing, they would have been completely wiped out if it wasn't for the fact the locals kept them alive so they could sustainably hunt them. Despite the massive size of the island, less than 2,000 people lived there, so we figured it would be pretty unlikely we'd run into anyone. Andre, who had visited these islands before, also assured us we'd be fine, and the locals just had those up to keep visitors from getting hurt. We only had a few hours of daylight left, so we didn't have much time to nut up. The days all feel so short on the equator. After a mile or two more we started to set up our first camp for the night. It is surprisingly tough to find a good spot because of how the islands were laid out. Closest to the shores were the beaches, which were rocky, are filled with sea lions that out of respect and our safety we didn't want to bother. Going inward, the beaches were replaced with swamps, rocky wastelands, and mangrove forests, all of which we really could comfortably camp out in. This left the mountainous areas. You could tell where the clouds meet the mountains because at those points the general rocky terrain became lush rainforests. The ground was soft and the trees beared fruit. Settling at about the tree line, we started breaking out our gear. Again, thanks to the shitty customs, we smuggled a whole host of gear we shouldn't have had. This included some alcohol. As the night came on, everyone other than myself got a bit drunk. My mom kinda ruined that for me. The 2 Germans were really hitting it off, so they shared a tent while I was stuck with Andre. I had to clean up the little mess we made since everyone was already asleep. As I was about to hit the hay myself, I heard the sound of a gun fire off into the night. I remember thinking out loud, man, it sure would be dumb to get shot. That unsettled me a bit, but not waning the adventure to end, and being with my new friends empowered me to get over it and go to sleep. As I drifted off, I remember the sounds of raspy howling. I managed to get to sleep, and my next memory was waking up to the Germans throwing a cup at my head. With so few hours in the day, we had to get moving early. We were low on food since we didn't have the money to buy more going into this, so we began picking some from the trees. I got a bit too careless and ended up falling from an avocado tree. Back to the ground, I could hear my friends laughing at my misfortune in their respective languages. That when the bush next to my head began to hiss at me, I was surprised, but after working with the animal it came from so much, I was able to figure out what was going on right away. After a moment, a giant tortoise dredged through the bush. I guess the sound of my fall freaked it out a bit. As it moved completely out of the bush, I was greeted with a scared shell of an at least 400-pound creature. It almost looked like it was the shell of a sea turtle whose shell was hit with a boat. I didn't put too much thought into it, and we all left the site. We liked the view from the beach, so as we moved we headed towards the beach. We had no real set destination and we wandered the beach. About midday, while we were taking a break from all the walking, we noticed the sea lions in the distance bolting for the water. Out of the blue, a small pack of big dogs were closing in on us. While we had machetes, we were pretty outmatched and tried to escape. The dogs were way too fast and we had no time to pick up any gear that wasn't already on us. There was a patch of extremely jagged volcanic rock that we fled onto. Thankfully it was too much for the dogs and they didn't follow us. With some extra motivation with me throwing rocks at them, they moved on. I took note of an especially huge pit bull that seemed to be the leader of the pack. The dogs seemed to be really booking it out of there at one point after noticing something we hadn't. As we were catching our breaths, another figure began to approach us. It was too tall to be a dog, so we assumed it was a local. As much as I rather not get in trouble after the dogs, I really didn't mind any help. It was flying towards us and it quickly became apparent that it wasn't a person. It was an all-black figure on all fours, effortlessly moving over the black rocks that littered the ground. It took us all a second to react before yet again we found ourselves running. While it wasn't as fast as the dogs, it was more than able to keep pace over the rocks. It slowed down as it started to tail us, just staying out of reach. While running, the only feature I could make out was its massive white teeth that contrasted its black body. I think we all knew its hesitation would last and we all bolted to some huge cacti sticking from the rocks. Never before have I climbed an object so quickly. I don't remember feeling an ounce of pain from the spines in the moment. The head of the beast slammed into the base of my cacti as I just got out of its reach. I looked over to see Andre in his own cacti with the two Germans in another. I strained every muscle to get a footing and not slide down. My cactus was just a single column and, dodging by its reaction to the impact, not very stable. I picked the short straw. As the adrenaline wore off, I got a chance to study the creature now pacing around us. Its most defining feature was its massive head. It took up at least a third of its body. It looked like it could barely hold it up. I was finally able to pick out its eyes, which were all pupil. Its eyes were huge and unblinking, focusing on its prey. Its snout had whiskers that seemed almost comically long. A little lower was its mouth, lined with different teeth and at least 2 sets of canines. Its body looked almost like a dog's, but covered in scales like that of a marine iguana, but smoother. I started to notice the pain from the spine sticking into me and felt my grip going. I called over to my friends to try and think of a way out. The thing in response bolted at me and again rammed my cactus. For what felt like an eternity we tried to communicate with our hands whenever we could between gripping the cacti. Evening was coming and things didn't get better. The blood that pooled still the basis of the cacti was being sniffed and lapped at by the beast. Looking at the huge eyes and dark body, I figured this thing would fuck us once it got dark. We are able to communicate to each other that we needed to bolt for the rainforested area we came from. We could climb the trees and stay there till the thing moved on. Maybe sensing our desperation, the creature moved behind some rocks. Only after writing the journal did I realize it was peeping for an ambush. and told me later that it was still in view for her, and it was focusing on me. With the deepest breath of my life we dropped from the cacti and bolted for the tree line. The monstrous form of the creature leaped from the rocks and gave chase. Like it was fucking with us, it say just out of reach. About 100 feet from the tree line the creature seemed to be over with playing with us. It lunged at me. It let out that raspy roar I remembered from the night before as it closed in. Max, being a fucking bro, threw his machete at the thing grazing its face. It seemed like this save brought us enough time, but at the same time Anne lost her footing and fucked up her ankle. The roar startled her. Max threw one of her arms over his shoulder, and after being saved I rushed over to help. Andre was well into a tree already as we dragged her to the tree line. The thing followed but kept some distance. We dragged her up a huge avocado tree, or maybe we were next to an avocado tree. It seemed like the thing could climb and again just passed around the trees for a bit. Our footing was perfect in the trees and it seemed like it figured that out quickly. Defeated, it left into the night. Behind those deep eyes was a thinking creature. Later in life I learned a lot about vertebrate evolution in college. One group of creatures drew my attention like no other. Synapsids or stem mammals are the group of reptiles that would eventually lead to modern mammals. Before the dinosaurs they ruled the land. Out of them came the therapsids, which further brought them to a mammal-like state. My teacher owned a cast of a creature belonging to the order and I was shocked with how similar it looked to the creature I saw in the past. I am quite certain looking back that this animal is a member of one such creature from the order Gorgonopsid. The resemblance to Pic related is unnerving to me. It took us a moment to talk. We didn't say a word about what happened and just talked about getting the fuck out of there. With some rope we tied Anne up to the tree and applied the first aid. It was clear Anne was gonna need some help to move anywhere. We tried our best to rest in the trees but the sound of pitter-pandering feet kept us on edge. While it seemed to come from much smaller creatures, it was clear there was more than one out there. My heart dropped as I heard the sound of cracking. The only thing I could compare it to was the sounds from a video of an alligator eating a turtle. What was going on out there probably wasn't too different. Further up the mountain we could see fire and hear gunshots. Andre muttered, "We should go up to it." We agreed, but would wait till next morning. Going down there with no visibility wasn't an opinion. Morning came, and while we weren't well rested, we were ready to move out. We decided that we would leave Anne in the canopy and come back with help. Max grabbed her hand and promised her he'd be back for her. It was in German, but I like to imagine he said something along those lines. The peak ended up being on a whole different mountain. By midday it became clear that it would get dark before we got there. Evening came and we ascended the mountain. We were sent into a panic as we heard the sound of dogs behind us. The brush was being disturbed violently enough for us to hear it a ways back. Our spring of activity also sent a more nearby patch of foliage into risking fit as well. The mountainside became so steep we ended up crawling on our hands and feet. We shot through the tree line onto flattened land. We were quickly noticed by the various dogs chained to trees which barked their alarms. Any one of those things would have fucked us up. The locals crawled out their shacks kicking glass bottles out of their way as they moved towards us. They were carrying weapons, which at least in the moment seemed nature since we just barged into their little town in the night. One with a bat walked up to us and shouted something in Spanish at us. I'm not sure about Max, but I was at least not in a state to understand Spanish in the moment. Whatever he said though made Andre's face pale. The two seemed to argue in Spanish for a moment before Andre motioned his hands at Max and I. I was just beginning to adjust and I was pretty sure he was selling us out. Out of nowhere the man smashed the bat on Andre's head. Without a second thought Max and I threw ourselves down the mountain through the tree line. The sound of firearm going off and the dogs bolting got us back on our feet from the fall and running. The commotion of us moving through the brush and the dogs now barreling down the mountain drew out an animal that was probably following us up the mountain. It was another one of those black things but much smaller than the one that chased us. Coming out into the open between us and the dogs, it was mauled instantly. I almost felt bad as I glanced back at it in the moment. Even though the sounds of gunfire didn't stop, the dogs seemed preoccupied. Yet again I was saved by chance. We ran through the night on high alert, picking fruit when we passed them. By late morning we managed to return to where we left and after explaining the situation to N, we were stumped. It seemed like the only way to get out of this was to be aligned to Puerto Villamil. Before we left though, we needed to rest. For some reason we thought we should go back for Andre. With N the way she was and Max kinda saving my ass, I told them to go while I went back. I think deep down my pride was wounded by how selfless Max was, so I had something to prove. I would leave after them so I could rest a bit more, but the moment the two of them started moving, the big black creature appeared again. I threw a rock at it, hitting it in its big eye. With a snarl it jumped in the other direction. I hopped out of the tree I was in and made a shitload of noise. I hope I seem selfless cause I was about to pee myself away running from those Germans. I made my way back towards that settlement we were chased out of. I got to the point where we heard the dogs the last time and saw some disturbance a bit off the path. I thought it would be some stupid horror movie shit to go over there, but I needed to see. In the center of some torn up plants was the body of the big pit bull that seemed to lead the pack that attacked us before. The massive dog was partially eaten, but the black strips of flesh on the ground and dangling from what was left of its mouth showed it for sure put up a good fight. The scene was enough to make me reconsider my plans and instead try to move towards Puerto Villamil too. I got high enough to spot where I needed to go. There was a mangrove forest swamp between me and Puerto Villamil I could cut through to get there. I spent the rest of that day in a half jog. There was enough solid ground between the wet patches of swamp and mangrove trees to keep a comfortable pace. Night came and passed and I hadn't an issue. Feeling home free, I slowed my pace enough to watch some of the birds, the reason I was on the island to begin with. Morning passed and I could see the wailing wall I passed so many nights ago. I was almost in a daze looking. A group of flamingos in the swampy water when out of nowhere they jumped into flight. Startled myself, I saw the creature coming towards me through the mangrove. I jumped into the water hoping it wouldn't follow. My brain moving in overdrive realized how dumb of an idea that was as soon as I hit the water. This thing's tail looked like something you'd see on an alligator, and what kind of animal living on an island can't swim? I grabbed for a vine to pull myself out of the swamp. The water must not have been that deep because as I pulled myself up on the other side it just run right through the water. The webs on mangrove vines made moving difficult for both of us. I managed to stay ahead thanks to being smaller, but I had to be careful not to corner myself. The chase didn't last more than 30 seconds before I managed to start hitting dead ends. Hearing its gallop behind me closen, I pulled out my machete and swatted the thing with it. My dull machete connected with its snout but didn't manage to cut it all. It did jump back a bit. I tried to pull some vines between myself and it, but with one bite it managed to rip the wooden vines enough for it to pass without a problem. I knew I couldn't fight this thing before, but that moment really hammered it in for me. Somewhere along my phone fell into the swamp, rip penguin pictures. Again I was at a dead end. The vines were much thicker here and I was cornered. Things were moving in slow motion as it came closer to me. The whole life flashing before my eyes thing had never happened before or since then. I threw my machete at its head and turned away from me for a moment. Out of pure reflex from 15 years of wrestling, like taking a shot, grabbed its front leg and threw myself by the thing. I guess it didn't expect that and it fell through some of the vines. That misstep with its huge head having trouble maneuvering around the dead end, it seemed unable to move for the moment. Without looking back I ran as fast as I could to the wailing wall and onto the established path, shitting my pants literally in the process. I didn't see those things ever again after that and I meet up with the Germans who beat me there. For the last 2 days we had on the island till our boats arrived, we just spent the time sitting around reflecting what had happened. We went to the police on the island, but they seemed completely disinterested and kicked us out of the station. I never saw Andre again, but I suspect his story didn't end on that island. If it did though, plenty of people fall to their deaths on those islands, and he may have just been written off as one of those. I eventually returned back to the States, and still keep in contact with Max. This was by far the most messed up stuff I ever had to deal with in my life, but looking back now I just feel bad about those things. They were just trying to live as they had been on those islands before we came. I'd like to go back one day and try to find them again, when I am more properly prepared. All these pictures are things I or my friends took, so while they are authentic, they weren't taken during this ordeal. I enjoyed writing out this again, and I hope you guys found it interesting. Well, the thread is still alive, so I'll do one more green text. This story isn't about something I went through but rather my older brother. I'll just jump into it. Be my brother. Real good guy but gets involved with some nasty stuff in his life. Since 16 he has always had a firearm of some kind holstered on his hip. Once got suspended for beating a kid half to death for harassing my sister. This started a little over a year ago after our aunt died. She was pretty eccentric and never managed to marry. My brother and I were tasked with cleaning out her house so we could sell it. There was always a rumor she owned a spell book or grimoire. I'm not sure what the difference is between them, so we kept a special eye out for any old-looking book. As we got towards the last of the boxes, we found one with a note attached to it. It was addressed to our grandmother, who in our aunt's years ended up being her last and only real friend. The note was addressed to her, and it asked for our Nana to dispose of what was in the box and asking her not to judge her. I guess she wanted to get rid of the stuff herself, but had some attachment to all the stuff in there that prevented her from doing it. My Nana was too old to help us clean the house, so my brother and I opened it. Inside was tons of taboo items, from old Keque medallions to crystal balls. There was also the book that had to be the book everyone was talking about. It was old and used looking. The symbols, while worn, were still visible on the cover. In the middle of the cover was a white stone which I had assumed to be quartz, surrounded by symbols which looked like something out of a video game. The box was all pretty shocking, and while we wanted to carry out our aunt's wishes, we both decided to take something out of the box to keep. I ended up taking a chipped crystal ball, pick related, while my older brother took the book. Almost right away within the first week things seemed a bit off. Our youngest brother always tended to yell and walk in his sleep, but almost every night we'd catch him running around at night. We just assumed he was staying up late fucking around, but he seemed like he was in a trance when confronted. My older brother seemed to carry it around with him everywhere, flipping through the pages. He became paranoid and would get spooked easily. After about a month, he told me he would get rid of the book at the dump. At least for me, it seemed like he put it off for a month but managed to get rid of it about a month later. I heard a different story a while later from his best friend one New Year's Eve when the two of them got blackout drunk. Apparently my brother did take it to the dump when he said he did, but it found it the next morning on his desk. Understandably freaked out, he brought it to our local church, who said they'd take care of it, but like the last time it was right on his desk the next morning. He ended up throwing it away some more, giving it to a local Jehovah's Witnesses compound, and even burned it, but it always came back to the same spot. He had been planning a road trip with his best friend, where they'd travel cross-country on bikes for a while now, and decided he'd try to ditch it in the desert. I'm not sure why he decided to do it, but I guess it made sense to him. They'd camp out on the side of the road or stay in motels as they traveled, and his friend told me every night he could hear my brother whispering to the book. My brother was just conscious enough to have a look of concern in his face as I listened along. As they entered Nevada, my older brother fell off his bike. While he was okay, his bike was a bit roughed up and they decided to camp out on the side of the road for the night. As the sun began to set, a big bull started to approach them. The road ran alongside a fenced-in farm field, so it wouldn't be able to get to them. Still, having a huge animal staring at you as the sun went down was unsettling for them. They decided to try to fix the bike on the spot and go to a motel in the night. The bull was covered in scars and the friend swore he couldn't see its pupils. Eventually they managed to get the bike started again. As they were hopping on their bike, The cow spoke. He said it was as if someone tried to speak while inhaling. He didn't understand a word coming from its mouth, but whatever it said left my brother pale. Out of the blue my brother unloaded his gun on the cow, followed by the friend following suit. The cow ran off and without a word they continued onward. The sound of my brother speaking in the night grew louder, and whether they were outside or in a motel he could swear he saw shadows moving around in the dark. Eventually they stopped in the middle of the desert in New Mexico. My brother threw it on the ground and spit on it. As if it came from nowhere, a bull appeared out of the heat waves and yet again. It slowly came towards them, staring at them with blank white eyes. At his wit's end, my brother kicked the book farther into the desert and shot a hole right through it. A red liquid, like blood, oozed out of the hole and it flipped itself open. The book and cow burst into flames. The cow continued to approach them regardless. It turned its head to the friend, then to my brother and again spoke something unintelligible. The book and cow seemed to crumble to ash not too long after. The two of them eventually returned home, and my friend said my brother never spoke of having issues with the book. I had also noticed not too long after that my brother returned to his normal self. I thought I'd just end with that last one, but some people are still bumping in my thread. I've really enjoyed writing out all these green texts. With thinking so much about the past and the recent stuff in the woods, some other stories of weird shit have come to my mind that I probably buried away. Be me. Around 14 years old. Up in the Pocono Mountains near Lake Wallenpaupack. With my siblings, I was staying up at my grandparents'. It was around where the wooded developments faded into hundreds of acres of state game land. I'd spend most of the days up there swimming in the lakes or roaming the deep woods. It was around noon when I was outside wandering the forest with my younger brother. He was kinda the black sheep out of us. Physically, while my other siblings and I were darker haired and eyed, he had really blonde hair and blue eyes. He isn't a bastard before you ask. He was also hyper-extroverted in contrast to everyone else. He is mischievous, emotional, an asshole, and an all-around pain in the ass to deal with. Still managed to love him like a brother. We were out, probably a bit deeper in the woods than we should have been, just wandering. I called out to him to check out some dead deer. No response. I looked around and he was gone. He likes to play tricks, often taking them too far, so I assumed he was hiding. For a good hour I walked around the patch of forest calling out for him. Out of frustration and the concern that this jackass may have actually been kidnapped, I yelled out, "I'm going home and getting the police to find you." Still no response. I ran home but was told just to take my older brother with me to find him. We'd call the police if we still couldn't find him. My older brother was much tougher on him, so I hoped hearing his voice he'd come out to avoid punishment. Again after another hour nothing. We eventually came back to the spot I last saw him there. He was resting under a tree like nothing was up. My older brother responded to this by beating the shit out of him for scaring everyone. He is a practicer of tough love. We just assumed he was following us in the bushes the whole time. Seeing how little bro didn't deny it, we all thought that was that. Keeping an eye on him after that stunt, the day turned to night. We were all sleeping in the basement which opened to the backyard and mouth of the forest. As we were all drifting to sleep I heard the door slowly slide open. Trying not to make a sound I peeked into the darkness, feigning sleep. It was little bro sneaking into the night. Wanting to prevent another shit show, but also wanting to catch him in the act, I sneaked out the front door to intercept him. The moment I quietly closed the door, I saw him bolt into the forest like a madman. Pissed off I followed suit. I like to think even at that time with all the sports and activities I did I was for sure in better shape than most, but my younger brother was a monster since he was walking. He had always been a bit of a jock. No matter how fast I ran, he not only managed to stay out of reach but widened the gap. He was so far ahead he didn't notice me following. In the darkness I lost sight of him after a few seconds. This for sure wasn't a prank or him sleepwalking, so I started to panic. As you've probably noticed, I often tend to make bad decisions in the heat of things. I didn't want to bother my family, so I decided to hunt him down. The only things up there in the night worth worrying about were black bears, and they'd become extremely rare in those parts, so I didn't feel too unsafe, I guess. From around me I heard the sound of shouting and screaming. It was like when my little brother would yell in his sleep normally, but I knew I saw him running into the woods. It was like it was coming from somewhere else every time I heard it. For some time I ran around, moving towards wherever I heard it. The yelling was joined by the sound of beating on the trunks and later rustling around me. I didn't have much time to think about it because just then I found my brother. Under a tree, eyes closed, he was just chilling there. Not wanting to deal with that shit again, I threw him on my back and piggyback carried him home. I had plenty of experience carrying unconscious bodies like this thanks to being an older brother. I was tired and disoriented, so as I moved home, neglecting to ask myself questions like, why did he run into the woods at night? Why is he sleeping outside half-dressed in the cold night? With my little brother on my back, why do I hear the sounds around me? Why am I not pissing myself? I got home and fell asleep within seconds. It was such a bizarre situation that it felt like a dream. I'm pretty sure though it wasn't a dream because he tried to sneak out again the next night. He was stopped before going out that time, but I wasn't crazy, he did sneak outside. The situation was odd enough, but my memory of it makes it weirder. For starters, I remember everything in way too much detail, even to this day. It's like I can still see the patterns on the bark itself. Every step, every twig snapping, I can remember it all in way too clear of detail. It's also like all the images in my mind are in a grayed out filter rather than the darkness of a forest at night. My actions were strange and felt uncharacteristic of me. After these events, my brother also adopted another habit in his sleep. He'll slowly pick up his leg and drop it to the ground. It freaks me the fuck out, and even the last time I saw him asleep he was still doing it. Maybe this is more explainable than I think it is, but looking back the whole memory disturbs me. Something was up, though I'm not really sure.